Welcome to our Fireside Chat on Zero Trust. I'm Senior Researcher Kate Macri, and discussing Zero Trust with me today is Paul Puckett, Director of the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency at the U.S. Army. So to start off today's conversation, Paul, can you discuss your Zero Trust priorities for 2022 and how the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency is helping the Army move towards a Zero Trust architecture?
Absolutely, Kate, and thanks for having me. So the Army spend is Army Digital Transformation Strategy. This is being championed and led by Dr. Iyer, the CIO of the Army. And really critical to that digital transformation strategy is this pivot into Zero Trust architecture. So as you can imagine, globally, we've been fielding systems and accrediting those systems in construct of kind of a network perimeter security model, and this pivot into Zero Trust really changes the way not only our infrastructure is delivered, our enterprise services are delivered, but then also how our applications and services, and most importantly, our data is structured to leverage a Zero Trust architecture. And so that's being led by Major General Matt Easley, who's the Chief Information Security Officer for the Army. And the partnership there and the role of the ECMA is really being that proving ground for what a Zero Trust architecture needs to look like. Delivering not only the infrastructure, but also the enterprise services, as well as also demonstrating how applications and services, enhancing the Army mission need to be designed. And so part of that partnership, we've had an effort ongoing here for the past couple of months that we call Project Drawbridge. And it's starting to look at software-defined perimeter that not only enforces some critical components of Zero Trust, but also allows us to expand how we connect globally, especially in context of a distributed workforce. So with COVID, obviously the major shift that happened, a lot of people moved home and started to do their jobs on untrusted networks. And one of the first things that came up was a white paper that we helped write, understanding the existing way that we've delivered our systems and secured those systems, assuming someone's living on essentially the DoDIN backbone, becomes a major limiting capability when it comes to now this distributed workforce working from home. So how do we start to expose these services to a distributed workforce, but be mindful when it comes to our security posture? And that's what Project Drawbridge is trying to tease out, is what does this new network architecture for ingress and egress look like? How do we start to get more insurances when it comes to the people and the devices accessing the applications and services in a secure manner from unknown and untrusted networks. And then beyond that, actually having the fine-grained control when it comes to data and services being essentially applied as an enterprise capability within those applications, brokering real-time secure access to information. And so part of our priorities here in 22 is taking what's learned in Project Drawbridge and actually implementing that as the core components of the enterprise cloud environment that we call C-Army, and enabling really this transitional architecture that moves from this network perimeter security model that we have today, driven by the BCAPs, the boundary cloud access points, and really the core components of the secure cloud computing architecture, and moving more towards that kind of cloud access security edge, service edge, and security broker model when it comes to distributed users and systems accessing data in a secure manner globally.
So what are some of the challenges associated with cloud security that Zero Trust and Project Drawbridge can address?
Well, there's a few different pieces. First is kind of the main stomping point that I lean into when we talk about the components of a Zero Trust architecture. And that's really the maturity of an identity credentialing and access management service. There are a number of systems today that actually roll their own identities internally and have their own logic when it comes to how users and then even other systems access their capabilities and their data. And that is essentially target number one when it comes to moving to a Zero Trust architecture, in my opinion, because you have to start working off of a more centralized model when it comes to how credentials and identities are being understood by the enterprise, and then the attributes of those identities and how you're going to be managing access to capabilities, services, and data within them. And if everyone's coming with their own logic, especially with their own identities, It's kind of the side of zero trust that I joke that is maybe not what we're intending, which is never able to establish trust. So essentially what we've got to get after is how these applications are designed, and that's becoming more and more evident, especially when we talk about the logic. And so if you talk about an enterprise approach to ICAM, it means that there's an enterprise and federated model around identities and attributes. And then the logic for role-based access or even some attribute-based access has to be something that is understood by the enterprise and then applied by the applications. And that's a configuration change for many of our applications today as to where that logic is coming from. But then even beyond that, it's especially highlighting how we have to get after data tagging in a more effective and efficient manner, because we can't put the right policies in place when it comes to enforcement for access if we don't actually understand the attributes of data that we're trying to protect. And so I think this leads into a few different things. I think we've seen across the DoD this kind of cry out saying that we overclassify data. And I think that's just simply because we're producing data at such an alarming rate. Is our ability to go and tag this data often comes down to a human being going and analyzing each data set. And so how we start to leverage these data platforms and data pipelines to start to get after this conditioning of data and this tagging of data, I think is a thing that we're starting to really prove with Project Drawbridge. We always knew it was the case, but it's becoming more and more evident that essentially the applications and services that are designed to leverage an architecture this way are simply treating all data as this big clump of data at the highest classification. And if we really care about data loss prevention, we really need to get into understanding the data in a more fine-grained way so that these applications can enforce it, leveraging these enterprise policies.
So what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions around zero trust, and how are you working to dispel these at the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency and the larger Army network?
Well, I think one of the biggest kind of myths about zero trust is you'll hear a lot of vendors talk that they enable zero trust or they have a solution for zero trust. And I wouldn't even put it on the vendors themselves, even those across the DoD. A lot of people start to talk about moving to a zero trust architecture to be something that is predominantly a technology that has to be bought. And I think that that's really just fundamentally wrong. So much about zero trust and zero trust architecture gets after essentially how you're designing an enterprise ecosystem. It gets after your policies. It gets after even the skill sets of people. There are a number of other things that you have to do that is actually the practice of a zero trust architecture, more so than just the actual technology that's being leveraged. And this is being done really in a number of different ways. We have a number of discussions, like I'm having here with you, to start to highlight these challenges when it comes to, it's not just the technology, it's how you use it. It's understanding the work that has to be done, especially like I said, when it comes to the tagging of data. It's understanding the configuration changes that they themselves are going to have more than likely contractual scope issues that have to be addressed, a resource issue that has to be addressed to allow us to transition to this architecture. And then also what I've been saying internally is so many of our systems that run the mission today, people call them legacy systems, but it's what's keeping the lights on for the mission of the DoD, were designed and accredited assuming a network perimeter security model. And so if we want to start leveraging those services in a more distributed manner, leveraging these zero trust architectures, we have to understand that we really need a transitional architecture. We need to understand that there are going to be some limitations when it comes to access to services today that we've got to put in place to allow this pivot to a zero trust architecture. But we're going to kind of have the two worlds that we live in, quite frankly, because some systems and the way they're designed and accredited, really, they're probably just going to have to stay where they are and designed where they are because it's too much of a resource impact, I would argue, to try and force feed them, kind of force fit them into a zero trust architecture. And so this is done, by communication out in the public. It's being done internally in discussions that we're having, but it's also components that we start to bring up when maybe the topic's not even a zero trust architecture, but we start talking about system design and service design and integrations with other capabilities, especially around the conversations in JADC2 is acknowledging how do we start to implement key components that is a stepping stone into a zero trust architecture where we're not creating systems today that essentially have to function within the ecosystem that they're in today that are now essentially being held back by our ability to move forward into a zero trust architecture. So how do we start to plant the right seeds, say for instance, with systems that are coming online, forcing them to start to consume more enterprise services when it comes to ICAM. You see this evident in the work that was done in the adoption of 365 across the DoD. So pieces that start to lean, how do we start to plant those seeds now? So we're having these discussions really across every single system that's even being designed and implemented today is what are the pieces that we need to be put in place so that we're already on the journey to a zero trust architecture rather than creating more things that we have to clean up later on down the line.
So that's a good segue into my next question, which is around challenges associated with implementing zero trust. You mentioned needing a transitional architecture and coming up with solutions to integrate capabilities and basically get everyone on board with like a zero trust model. Can you discuss some of the challenges associated with this and with some of the stepping stones that you need to take to get to a full zero trust approach to cybersecurity?
Absolutely. So there's a few. I'll hit them in kind of the enterprise services as well as the infrastructure side, and I'll hit policy here last. From an enterprise services perspective, I think it's highlighting the need for ICAM capabilities now. This is something internally I've been chatting about is when you start to leverage cloud infrastructure, and I think this is the reason why I'm involved in this conversation with the ECMA is we're delivering cloud infrastructure, we're delivering these enterprise services. We kind of have this opportunity right now when it comes to an investment in applications to start to design and leverage cloud infrastructure thoughtfully. There's an opportunity here for investment to start to lay down the pieces of what we need to implement a zero trust architecture. So I've been saying those like, hey, like everyone coming to my front door that has their own credentialing method internally, I'm going to force them into an enterprise service. But that enterprise service needs to understand what a non-person entity is. It needs to understand essentially how services are going to be essentially bringing themselves online and need to be understood by the ecosystem and then securely passing data across that ecosystem. That kind of real-time aspect of how services come online, especially in the ephemeral nature of cloud infrastructure, it needs an ICAM solution to support it. So starting to highlight these enterprise capabilities and how they need to be designed to support this more real-time model is really critical. And I think one of the biggest challenges, so many of our systems are designed with a lot of human-driven processes around them when it comes to implementation. And so this notion of essentially personas versus just persons, right? Like a human always interacting with the thing is now systems starting to interact with different things. Like our ability of an enterprise capability to support that evolving world is really limited, especially then when we start talking about joint all domain command and control, like something like with the JADC2. If each one of the services are coming with their own logic and their own attributes for people and services and data, that means that we're still conflicting with one another and we're not able to pass data securely in real time. So now this becomes moving at the speed of the DoD, which we know is hard from an enterprise services perspective. So then what are the right things that you essentially need to wait for and what are the right things you need to move on right now? I think that's one of the biggest challenges around enterprise services, especially across the DoD. From an infrastructure perspective, I think it's also then this move to where do we have the compute and storage that's able to accommodate this real-time building, this real-time learning. That's where you see a lot of these initiatives born out of the cloud, which is wonderful. But then how do you start to introduce some of those lessons learned into on-premise ecosystems thoughtfully? I think that's one of the challenges of our infrastructure there. And then now when you've got these public resources as well as these private on-premise resources, how do you start to connect them in a way that enables this more dynamic real-time communication? I think it's starting to really highlight some challenges with our wide area networks globally across the DoD. You see this talked about when we start saying that we're going to leverage more commercial services when it comes to how we connect and secure and transport data. So how we start to collapse that footprint of how we've handled networking and circuits across the DoD, I think is going to become a big challenge for us. But I think the opportunity there as well is much like our inefficient consumption of compute in a data center. I think there's a lot of inefficient consumption of transport. and all these kind of different one-off solutions that we have, when we start to leverage more as a service models and more enterprise models for how data is brokered, I think we're going to see a massive opportunity to right size our use of transport. But there's going to be a challenge. Who's paying for what? What do we do now? What are the critical locations that we need to start to enable in this wide area network? That's all investment. That's all time. And again, what do you do for yourself versus what do you wait for the DoD to address? That's just forcing us to have even better conversations as we start to talk service to service. So then even on the policy side of the house, is starting to see new policies come out that enable this more distributed model. You start to see words start to be changed ever so slightly. For instance, with the Cloud Security Requirements Guide, you start to see us talking about impact level 5 data and this need for physical isolation, start to tease into this world of logical isolation. You start to see new reference architectures that come out, the GovCIO articulating the need for essentially cloud native access when it comes to the cloud that's not brokered by just an internet access point, the DOT backbone, and a boundary cloud access point, as we're starting to see a more open architecture for access to the cloud from a policy perspective. But the challenge is there again is what services do you start to advertise outside of those new security brokers for access to services and data in the cloud versus what still needs to be advertised through this legacy model? What are some transitional services that you can put in place when it comes to essentially non-VPN access to those applications that's maybe seen as a stepping stone? While we start to tweak the systems and the data in the back end, we start to see and tag our data more effectively. These are all things that each one of the services have to wrestle with. Meanwhile, still operating and meeting our mission. And so I think there's a number of things from an enterprise service and infrastructure and a policy perspective that are going to be challenging. And it's having that appropriate, kind of forethought of what are good investments now versus what is something that we really need to start to move together on. That is just, that's hard. That's not easy. I think that's always been the wrestle, but I think it's people starting to acknowledge that we have to start kind of designing these things as we go together and seeing where the edges are. Because if we just take the traditional model of, a massive acquisition to get it right 5 years down the road, we know for a fact we're probably going to be wrong. So we need to start to kind of be building these systems together. And that's what you see a lot happening, within the Army cloud today is you start to see this cross collaboration of organizations realizing these dependencies of these architectures, realizing the need to pivot from a fixed into a distributed capability, and then seeing the need then for these enterprise services to overlay. And this is really critical for the Army because when we talk about unifying the enterprise and the tactical domains as part of the Unified Network Plan coming out of the Army G6 and General Morrison, something like enterprise ICAM is critical. Understanding a WAN in that architecture is critical. Being able to essentially, define networks in software and in real time is critical. And we start to see some of these components that are really the building blocks for a zero trust architecture to then allow us to pass data globally in a secure manner.
Secure software acquisition and development are two topics gaining a lot of momentum in DoD tech discussions. Last week, DoD announced a shift towards continuous authorization to operate to enhance system security. Can you talk a little bit about how Zero Trust can integrate smoothly with these discussions and policy shifts? Do you see secure software acquisition development, continuous authorization to operate, and Zero Trust as compatible security goals with the Department of the Army?
Yeah, there's a lot of complex pieces in there for the uninitiated. When it comes to secure software acquisition, I think there's a few different pieces. I'll also call out the open source memo that also recently came out as well from the DoD CIO. Is really understanding when we source software from vendors, more often than not, there is a supply chain of software for where all of those bits came from that we need to understand, they need to understand, especially if we want to secure that app, that software coming not only today, but tomorrow and the next day and beyond. This was highlighted when it came to Log4j, and the vulnerability that came through there is seeing where that component was essentially embedded into commercial off-the-shelf software that just resided in numerous places across the DoD, that then we had to patch in real time, which became more so our communication relationship and then how we source that software from those vendors. And so being mindful of that software supply chain is really critical. And if we think about all the different ways that we source software from vendors, maybe even the same software from the same vendor in a number of different ways, depending on the program across the Army or even the DoD, we see the challenge really, really growing. So when it comes to the acquisition side of the house, is actually understanding that chain. If anyone's contributing code, if we're getting software from anyone, we need to make sure that we've got all of the legal hooks when it comes to how we source that software, that they're coming with the components that we need to be able to securely test and deploy that within our environment, then also support that in real time every day beyond that. So the legal T's and C's, the timeliness when it comes to vulnerabilities, the reporting of vulnerabilities, understanding who is consuming that software within the DoD, that they're actually subscribing to the feeds of the information when it comes to these vulnerabilities, especially now then articulating a secure bill of materials when it comes to all the components and where they're getting those components is really critical. But then you also got to think about what are the tools and the mechanisms, what are the ways that we track this information when it comes to how essentially a component of software is being tagged or labeled or named within that bill of materials. Are they following the actual approved formats that are coming out of the executive order? Are there tools and services that we're leveraging to be able to see and understand that data in real time? It's a really complex ecosystem. So I don't think a lot of people have considered the services that they need to put in place in order to effectively track and manage a software bill of materials, not only from the bits themselves, but also the legal side of the house as well. So that's now all language that has to be captured in new contracts. That's language that has to even probably be cleaned up in existing contracts. So you've got to think about the full life cycle of how we acquire software or we've acquired software and start to clean up that world, because we have contracts that have been out there for a number of years that are the ones running our operational capabilities today. And if they didn't account for each one of these T's and C's, we've got to go and clean that up. But then on the services side of the house, we need an environment and an ecosystem that facilitates the real-time management of all of this information. My concern would be is that when it comes to something like a software bill of materials, is that we've got a whole bunch of people with just a massive Excel spreadsheet of information, of stale data, trying to manage this and thinking that that's an effective way to solve the problem. We have to stop doing stuff like that and start to move to more real-time automated systems for how we ingest this information and manage this information that actually makes sense at the speed that we're going to have to be tackling this challenge.
So what kind of support or buy-in do you seek from Army leadership to help the Army get where it needs to be in terms of a zero trust environment in the cloud?
I think you see it in a few different places. One, our cyber themselves as the senior champions when it comes to all things cybersecurity. A lot of movement there when it comes to their involvement in articulating the components needed for a zero trust architecture. You see it in relationship then with Major General Easley as the CISO and the CIO of the Army, where we're talking about the core components needed when it comes to implementing a zero trust architecture. I'll even call a recent offsite that we had with a number of senior leaders in the IT domain, where we talked about the criticality of an enterprise ICAM solution that ties the enterprise and the tactical domains, being a critical foundational component to a zero trust architecture. And immediately the cyber COE leaning in, immediately POEIS, NetCom, as well as the CIO leaning in when it comes to what are the things that we're doing today and what are the things that we need to be doing tomorrow to ensure that we're getting after this quickly. It just was recently part of the RDP assessment that cyber COE came out when it comes to the new ICAM requirements for the Army and how we start to implement some of those capabilities today. We see that even evident some of the experimentation that's ongoing in the cloud right now, starting to leverage enterprise ICAM solutions and seeing how they actually function within our tactical domains today, and actually in the midst of testing that out right now around the world. And so we start to see people move, but this has been communicated all the way up to the Secretary of the Army. We have regular meetings, even with the Undersecretary of the Army and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, where we talk about what's happening when it comes to all things data and cloud and modernization, and the core components of a zero trust architecture being talked about in explicit detail in those meetings, of ways that we're leaning in right now to start to lay that foundation. And thankfully, those discussions were started years ago. Those seeds were planted years ago when it comes to the modernization of what's needed. And so now the cyber COE was just really leveraging that existing relationship and the imperative around data, cloud computing, and software, and critical modernization. And so you've had buy-ins from senior leaders really for years now. And so it's not like we're starting at zero here. It's something where, like the cyber COE said that you needed a cloud plan when it came to implementing the cloud in a zero trust manner. We checked that box. We've had that for over 2 years now. So we've had great support from Army senior leaders. But then getting at the actual doing level of the Army, I think sometimes it's tough for people to see, okay, then what's different about what I've been doing and how I've been doing it. And then especially, like I said, the investment on the applications and data side of the house. What are the critical systems that need to be optimized to leverage these architectures that are actually moving at the speed of what we're doing for enterprise services in the infrastructure? That's really critical. You see us leaning in there even around our ERPs, starting to optimize and modernize there. And then really in this last year, especially this year, is the optimization within our tactical systems to start to leverage these components as that becomes a now distributed capability rather than an ad hoc kind of external offline capability. And so you've got buy-in from senior leaders really across the board, which I'm extremely thankful for.
So we have time for one more question, which is, what advice do you have for civilian agencies with maybe lackluster cyber postures or that are just now embarking on a zero trust journey?
A few different things. If you don't understand the data that you have, how in the world can you support it and protect it appropriately? So I think a really critical component is when it comes to leveraging technology to help you identify as well as tag your data in real time, understand the attributes of data, start to catalog that, actually have a repository where you understand the data that you have and the attributes of that data, I think is really step number one. I see too many people leaning into building all these wonderful fun capabilities and saying that they're good to go, but they really don't even understand their data. And so you've got to get after that first, in my opinion. That's why I'm thankful for the data and cloud execution order that came out back in 2019 in the Army. It's because you said precisely that we need to understand and see our data. But then the complement to that then is we need to start to build the infrastructure and the services that actually allows us to secure that data. And so understanding, what that means, for instance, CASB, SASB, all these different acronyms that are being thrown out there, but how are you ensuring that the actual people, the devices, the services, all of those different calls for information that exist, access for information exist, are being securely brokered in real time? And how are you learning from your environment and how people are accessing data today? That's an investment in technology and resources and people, and more than likely an investment in changing some policy and reading the policy that you have for that now brokered secure access. And that's an investment that you're going to have to make from an enterprise services perspective. And then third is you start to learn your data and you start to implement these services, learning how people are using these capabilities and systems, I think is really critical, because you've got to understand the way that your workforce functions if you want to change it. And so understanding how people really are doing business today and the way that you can optimize that, start to save some money for how you guys are doing business, because this is a zero-sum game. There's no extra money just kind of sitting out there. We need to be really thoughtful when it comes to the investments that we make so that we can start to invest in the systems and the redesign, because there's going to be a lot of lift and a lot of work to clean up the systems that we have today to actually leverage a zero trust architecture. We're going to be feeling the pains of essentially the network perimeter security model that we've built for many years, and we're going to feel those pains for many years. if we're not being thoughtful about our investments. So understand your data, build some enterprise services to start to broker access, and then start to learn from your people, because you're going to have to find ways to optimize so you can invest in the systems that you critically need to move with you into the future to leverage the zero trust architecture thoughtfully.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your time today. And now we will pivot to our next panel.
Thanks, Kate.